Chumash Vayikra is all about Korbanos. And Chumash Vayikra is defined as Torah Sakoyanim. And in Parshas Sav, once again, starting off from Vayikra, continues in Parshas Sav. And today, we will be discussing the minhag, the importance of saying Parshas HaKorbanos b'kol yom. So the Gemara Menachos, posik in this week's Parsha, Zois HaTorah, la'oilo la'mincha l'chatas la'osham, and Chazal medayik the Loshen Zois HaTorah. Omer Shlokish, Maidich Siv Zois HaTorah la'oilo la'mincha, kol ha'oise b'Torah, ke'ilu hikriv oilo mincha chatas v'osham. Omer Rava, hai la'oilo la'mincha, oilo v'mincha maboy elai. Elo Omer Rava, kol ha'oise b'Torah, eino yitzorech. Lo oila, velo mincha, velo yasham. And Rabbi Yitzchak says, Maidich siv zois Torah's chatas, kol ha'oise b'Torah's chatas, kilu hikrev chatas, kol ha'oise b'Torah's osham, kilu hikrev osham. Do we have two opinions here, or three opinions? So there are various different pshotim, different interpretations of Resh Lakish and of Rava. Resh Lakish and Rava don't talk about kol ha'oisig b'Torah's chatos or kol ha'oisig b'Torah's oilo, but rather kol ha'oisig b'Torah. The Chofetz Chaim in Likutei Halachos, Sefer Chofetz Chaim and Kodshim, understands that Rava and Resh Lakish, just like Rabbi Yitzchak, are talking about Torah's HaKorbanos. The Marsha on the spot, the Menachos, says no. It's not coincidental. Rav Yitzchak is the one that says kol ha'oisig b'Torah's chatos, kol ha'oisig b'Torah's osham. Resh Lakish and Rava say kol ha'oisig b'Torah. So Resh Lakish and Rava say kol ha'oisig b'Torah is either ke'ilu hikrev kol ha'korbanos or eino yitzorech kol ha'korbanos. But it is significant to be medayik. Resh Lakish and Rava are not talking about kol ha'oisig b'Torah's chatos or kol ha'oisig b'Torah's osham, but kol ha'oisig b'Torah. And what is the difference between Resh Lakish and Rava? Resh Lakish says ke'ilu hikrev, and Rava says eino yitzorech. So the Chofetz Chaim once again explains, whenever Chazal say ke'ilu, it is as if. It is almost the same, but it's not the real thing. When Chazal say a mesaper loshen hara, if a person says loshen hara, it is ke'ilu he violated gimel averos chamuros shebeTorah, avodah zorah shevichasdom am gili arayis. So how do we relate to a boy in yeshiva that is talking loshen hara all the time? Would we relate to him as a guy that killed another bocher? Or he's a koifer be'ikar, or chas v'sholem agal harayis. Ke'ilu is only ke'ilu. It's not, in a way, it is similar. So the Chofetz Chaim explains, according to the Resh Lakish, learning Torah is somewhat like Korbanos, but it's not. It doesn't have the power, actually, of a korban. In a way, if you can't bring a korban, second best is learn Torah. Rava says to the contrary, this goal of Torah is far more powerful than this goal of Korbanos. And that is why kol ha'oisig b'Torah eino yitzorech. There's no need for a korban because what he is doing is far more important than Korbanos. And that is the difference between Resh Lakish and Rava. So according to the Chofetz Chaim, all three Amoraim are talking about Torah's HaKorbanos. The Marsha on the spot says no. Only Rav Yitzchak talks about Torah's HaKorbanos. Resh Lakish and Rava talk about kol ha'oisig b'Torah. And there's a nafka mina halacha l'maaseh, as we will see. So right now I'm skipping source number 2, and we go over to source number 3. Shulchan Aruch Siman Aleph. Toiv lo imar. Parshas Akedah, Parshas Amanas, Eres Adibis, Parshas Oile, v'mincha, v'shlomim, v'chatos, v'osham. So the loss of the Shulchan Aruch is, it's a good thing to do. It's not a chiyuv, but it's a good thing to do. Toiv lo imar. Siman Memches. Siman Memches is one of the very few simonim in which the Ramah comes before the Shulchan Aruch. Usually the Shulchan Aruch says what he has to say, and then the Ramah comments. You know, the Yosef called his Sefer the Shulchan Aruch, and the Ramah called his editions the Mappa, which is a tablecloth. After you build a table, you put on a tablecloth. Siman Memches, first you spread out the tablecloth, and then, where are we going to put this? Then you put the table under the cloth. So Siman Memches starts off with the Ramah. Oimer in Pashas HaTomid. V'psuke kov m'shabes oimer in Mitzvah Pashas HaTomid. Hagah starts off with Hagah, with the Ramah. V'oimer in Pashas HaTomid. So, Siman Aleph speaks about all the Korbanos. Siman Memches, specifically Pashas HaTomid. So it seems that Pashas HaTomid is different than all the others. Let's have a look at the Shulchan Aruch Harav. Siman Aleph in Shulchan Aruch Harav is a Medura Kama and a Medura Tanyona. Second edition, Medura Tanyona. V'yesa al kain, toiv ma'oid loim Pashas HaKorbanos. So makol mokim, mi sheyesh lo lev lilmoid v'lahavin, ein loim el afilu Pashas HaKorbanos b'kol yoim, el lefrokim, once in a while. V'day lo b'midas eiz makom, ki godel talmud ha'mever day meiser, v'day yediyas ha'Torah. Shulchan Aruch Harav says, Talmud Chacham that's learning doesn't need to say Korbanos. But that is in Siman Aleph. Siman Memches, Nagu kol Yisrael v'kovu al atzman choiva likros Pashas HaTomid b'kol yoim koidem atfila. And here he doesn't say that a Talmud Chacham doesn't need to. And he's very machmer. Kovu aleim choiva, Nagu kol Yisrael. So according to Shulchan Aruch Harav, the most important is Pashas HaTomid, and it comes before all the other Korbanos. Regarding other Korbanos, his opinion is Talmud Chacham doesn't need to say. So the Shulchan Aruch Harav coincides with which of the three Ameroim? In source number 1, which of the three Ameroim? If we say Ke'ilu Hikriv, and we explained before, Ke'ilu Hikriv is, it's second best. It's not mamish. So it would be preferable to say Karsa Korbanos. But in the entire Shas Halochi Rova, and when Chazal say Halochi Basroi, that means Rova. Rova says, Kol Oisik B'Torah Einoi Tzorech, Lo Chatas V'Lo Yoshem V'Lo Don't need Korbanos. And the Shulchan Aruch Harav coincides with the Marsho's Pshat, not the Chofetz Chaim's Pshat. The Marsho says, Kol Oisik B'Torah is any Torah. Lav Dafka Torah HaKorbanos. And that's why the Shulchan Aruch Harav says, if you're a lamdin and you sit and learn and you're a masmid, you don't need to say Pashas HaKorbanos. And that is based on Shittas Rava. Because Halochik Rava says, Kol Oisik B'Torah Einoi Tzorech. So the source of this halacha, Kol Oisik B'Torah Einoi Tzorech, is in Lechem Chamudois, on the Rosh in Masechet Brachos. And the Makor Chaim, the Shiur, writes 350 years ago, and he says, who is the one to decide I'm such a great lamdan I don't need to say the Korbanos? Are you really such a big lamdan? You're not mevatel Torah at all. So he says, in our day and age, and he wrote that 350 years ago, it's yohara for a person to decide, I don't need to say Korbanos because I'm sitting and learning. And he writes, you should say Korbanos. You're not such a big tzaddik, you're not such a big lamdan, you're not such a big masmid, and you could find the 5 minutes to say the Korbanos every day. That is what the Shiur writes in Makor Chaim. So, is there a difference between Pashas HaTomid and all the other Korbanos? Source number 7. Muta Lukris Kol Seder Hayom, Pashas HaKorbanos, or Mishnas Eizu Mekoimen. And that is Hilchas Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av, you're not allowed to learn Torah. However, everything that is Seder Hayom, you are allowed to say. And Parshas Korbanos, Shechanoch writes, is Seder Hayom. So the Mishnah Berurah is a surprise. Parshas Atomid, Parshas Korbanos, Mishnah says, "Makoyim deloi gora kol zeh, mamash koyim b'Torah v'maftirim b'Novi." This creates a Torah Tisha B'Av, and maftirim b'Novi. So how could we learn Torah? And how could we read Novi? Because it's Seder Hayom. Seder Hayom. V'hakol mepnei shu Seder Hayom. V'noagim lo metilim v'shiri yichud b'mincha. Aval gav dosa b'tam Torah kol Hayom. Kivin shederach v'kosh shora. U'bepozne noagim lo melem machlosai shel emesh v'shel Hayom. V'chein nochain. So the Mishnah Berurah writes that the minig in Posen is not to say Tilim. And even if you say Tilim every day, you have a kviyas. Tomorrow, you're going to say for 2 days. But Tisha B'Av, you should not say. Or bevade ein loima. And then the Mishnah writes, Kol shkin she'ein loima seder Korbanos hakosav b'soif simen aleph. V'ma shekosav b'shechanoch Parshas Korbanos, hainu Parshas Atomid. The Mishnah Berurah says, when the Shechanoch says you could say Parshas Korbanos Tisha B'Av, he means only Parshas Atomid, not the other Korbanos. So once again, the Mishnah Berurah, like we proved from Shulchan Aruch Harav, differentiates between Parshas Atomid and all the other Korbanos. Shibbolei Aleket is one of the Rishonim, and he quotes a lot from his brother Rabbi Yomin. The Kosev Rabbi Yomin Ochi, Neroi Yizlach. Shekriyas Parshas Atomid Choiva. Parshas Atomid is not only a minig, it's not only the right thing to do, it's a choiva. Teidar achoshu kein, sharei ein maskilin Parshas Atomid b'tfilah kamo shemaskilin psukei hamisofim b'tfilas musaf. What does he mean to prove? What does he want to prove? If it wouldn't be a choiva to say Parshas Atomid every day, why is it not in the Shemoneh Esrei? Just like in Tfilas Musaf, we say the psukim of Korban Musaf. Why don't we say the psukim of Korban Tomid every day v'shachas? Ma bein zeh lezeh. Tamidim v'mesofen are Korbanos tzibur. What does he want to prove? There's a chiyuv to say Parshas Atomid before davening. And that is why you don't need to say it in Shemoneh Esrei, because you already said it. But that's a Teimei Gedolah. Where does this chiyuv come from? Are there any chiyuvim besides the Uraisa and the Rabbanans? Are there any chiyuvim that don't have a source in Shas, in Mishnah, in Gemara? Shulchan Aruch Harav says, source number 6, Kavu al atzmam choiva. Kavu al atzmam choiva is the minhag becomes as if an obligation. So in my Svarim, I think in Minchas Osher Kloli HaMitzvahs, I wrote about the concept of Kibru Aleim Choiva. How does that work? But that's not for today. But the Shibbolei Aleket says it's a Choiva Me'ikar Adin. If it would be a Choiva Me'ikar Adin, I think it should be in the Shemoneh Esrei. Just like the Psukim of Musaf. So I don't understand, he says, must be a choiva, otherwise why isn't it in the Shemoneh Esrei? I think it's not in the Shemoneh Esrei because it's not a choiva. If it would be a chiyuv, why wouldn't it be in Shemoneh Esrei? Shemoneh Esrei is Anshe Knesses Egdoila. Goes all the way back. Letchilas Yemei Mishnah, even before the Mishnah, Anshe Knesses Egdoila. The earliest to know him was Shiur Anshe Knesses Egdoila. So, l'cha'oira, if not for the Shibbolei Aleket, we would say the reason the Korbanos are not in Shachas is because Shachas is a different nature. Shachas Mincha Marav every day is Nachmei. It's primarily about B'koshas Tzrochim. First, we brochas a Shvochi Shel Makom, then B'koshas Tzrochim, and then you say thank you. The Musaf is all about Korban. That's the essence of Tfilas HaMusaf, and that is why there is no Musaf. only Shabbos, Yom Tov, Rosh Chodesh, when there's a Korban Musaf. Shachris has nothing to do with Korbanos. And that is why we don't say Tomid in Shachris. So the Shabbat Leleket is somewhat of a big Chiddush. We go back, turn back the page to source number 1 and 2. So on source number 1, we saw 3 Divrei Ameroim. The kesher between Talmud Torah and Korbanos. The Shloka says, Oisik b'Torah ki ilu hikrev korban. Rava says, Oisik b'Torah eino tzorich korban. And we discussed the Chofetz Chaim explaining. Rav Yitzchak says, Kol oisik b'Torah's oilo ki ilu hikrev oilo. Oile tarchatos ki ilu hikrev chatos. Source number 2 is twice in Shas, and Tanis and a Megillah. And those are the psukim of Bris Ben Abesorim. When Avraham Avinu turns to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when he says, B'mei Eida ki yerishena, Omer Avraham Rabbeinu Shalom, Shem Yisol choyten lefanecho, Ato oitzelem kedor hamabel ukedor hapaloga. And if my children will transgress, will you destroy them like Dor HaMabel or Dor HaPaloga? Omer lo elav. Omer lefonav Rabbeinu Shalom hediyeni b'mei rishena. So what will be with them? Omer lo kcholei eglo mishaleshes ve'eiz mishulash. Omer lefonav Rabbeinu Shalom tinach bezman shebeis hamikdash kayim. Bezman she'en beis hamikdash kayim ma ta'eh aleim. And Avraham worries. As long as there's a beis hamikdash, there will be Korbanos, and you forgive their Averis, but what will we do after the Beis HaMikdash will be no longer? Omer, kvar tikanti lem seder Korbanos, bizman shekoram behem lefonai, marani alehem ki lo akrivem lefonai, vani moich alehem al kol avonoseihem. What does it mean, tikanti lem seder Korbanos? Rashi explains, b'yamei hamoyed. Every Yom Tov, we read the Parshas HaKorbanos of that Yom Tov. So what is the difference between source number 1, the Gemara Menachos, and the Gemara Tanis Megillah? I think there are 2 fundamental differences. The Gemara Menachos speaks about Kol Hu Oisek B'Torah. Oisek B'Torah means learning. The Bachen Sememem Zayin, quoted also by the Taz. What was the kesher between the Bach and the Taz? Who knows? The Taz was the son-in-law of the Bach. I assume they had a wonderful relationship because they were 2 great people, but the Taz disagrees a lot with the Bach. Happens all the time. My son-in-law would challenge me almost everything I say. I think I would have a problem. But I don't think the Bach had a problem because these great tzaddikim, all they wanted is emes, amito shel Torah. So the Bach and the Taz explain the nusach habrocha that we say every morning by Berchas HaTorah, shekedushono b'mitzvoisav v'tzivono lasoik b'divrei Torah. And they explain lasoik means iyun, not just reading. We don't say the bracha likro b'Torah, lasoik b'divrei Torah, which means we try to understand the depth and the clarity and the essence of Torah and mitzvahs. So the Gemara Menachos speaks about kol oisek b'Torah, kol oisek b'Torah soilo. The Gemara and Tanis and the Megillah, bizman shekorim behem, when they will read. Kriya is not asik. And the other nafkamina is, the Gemara Menachos speaks about every individual. If you learn, it is as if you brought Korbanos. Source number 2 is about Kriyas HaTorah shel HaTzibur. And that is Korbanos HaTzibur. Because what we read b'yamei hamoyed is Korbanos HaTzibur. In source number 1, it is Ki'ilu Ikrev Chatos v'Osham. These are Korbanos Yochid. And that is the difference between the two sources. Number one is the individual when he learns Torah. Number two is the tzibur when they read Kriyas Torah b'tzibur. And that is the difference between these two sugyas, and they're not the same. So one of the interesting questions is, this gula of kol ha'oisek b'Torah's chatos, is that only a gula for Korbanos, or it's across the board by every mitzvah? So al pi Kabbalah, person needs to perform all the Taryag mitzvahs sheb'Torah. But there are so many mitzvahs we can't do. There are mitzvahs that are mitzvahs on the Kohen, others on the Leviim. Some mitzvahs are only on a king, like having an extra Sefer Torah. How could everybody perform all the mitzvahs? So that's why the Bala Kabbalah say there's a concept of Gilgulim. Yonashima comes to the world once, twice, three times, who knows how many times. And every time, different person. Once you're a Kohen, once you're a Levi, once you're mad, once you're nice. And once you're Bisman Beis HaMikdash or Yekayim, and one is the Achachor Beis HaMikdash. However, the Mabit, does anybody know who was the Mabit? Shalosh Teshuvos Mabit. The Maharit was the son of the Mabit. The Maharit was Rabbi Yom Tov Tirani, and his father was Rabbi Moshe Tirani. That's a city in Italy. That's where they were. So the Mabit, 500 years ago, in a Sefer Beis Elokim, he has a Sefer Musar Beis Elokim, very choshev Sefer, and he writes, when you learn any mitzvah that you can't perform, it is as if you performed the mitzvah. So according to the Mabit, it's not only unique to Korbanos. Any mitzvah you cannot perform for any reason, if you live in Chutz La'aretz and you're not mafresh tumas u'maisis, if you learn hilchos tumas u'maisis, it is as if you were mekayim the mitzvah. And that is why, I'm not a chosed of learning Rambam, but the only way you could be confident that you learned all the mitzvahs al protein v'dek is you go through the Mishnah Torah. He's the only one that dealt with all the mitzvahs from A to Z. Taryag mitzvah sheb'Torah protein v'dikdukein. So if you want to follow the Mekabolim, the Mabit, and the Shlo, I think the best eitzah is go through the Mishnah Torah. Well, you could learn Sefer HaChinuch, which is far easier than going through the entire Rambam, or Sefer HaMitzvahs LaRambam. But I doubt that would be considered kol oisek b'Torah's chatos, because it's just a little drop, it's just a little taste. You don't really go through the halachas. So if you want to be Mekayim the Shlo and the Mabit, at some stage in your life, you need to go through the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam. It is only then that you know that you have the entire package. Taryag mitzvah sheb'Torah, protein, v'dikdukein. If not for the Mabit and the Shlo, we would say this idea is unique to Korbanos. Ve'ein lilmoid, ein ledamois, because Korbanos bom lechaperoven. And Avraham Avinu asked the Kodesh Baruch Hu, what will my children do if they won't have Korbanos? And that is when we have this Gula Kol Oisek, Kielu Hikriv Korban. So in Bava Metzia Kuf Yudala, there's an interesting story. Rabbi Baravua meets Eliyahu Hanavi, and they happen to meet in a basic chorus. Rabbi takes advantage of the amazing opportunity, and he asks various shaylas, and Eliyahu Hanavi gives answers. And then Rabbi says, wait a second, aren't you a Kohen? And Eliyahu Hanavi says, I am. So what are you doing in a basic chorus? He asks, what are you doing here? You're a Kohen. And Eliyahu Hanavi says, you really disappoint me. Aren't you booking and say that Taharis? Reb Shimon Bar Yochai says, Kivrei Goyim Eino Metamim Ba'oil. This is not a Jewish cemetery. Everybody buried here is a Gentile. And Kivrei Akum Eino Metamim Ba'oil. And Rabbi apologizes, and Rabbi says, I am barely boki in Arbos Dorim. I didn't learn Taharas. Because it's not so nogea b'zman hazeh. We don't have any kodshim, so we're not nizer b'taharas. Rashi explains, which Arbos Dorim did they learn? Moyed, Noshim, Nezikin. They needed to learn because it's nogea b'kol atar v'ataru b'kol zman. But they didn't learn Zroim because they were in Bavel. They didn't learn Taharas. So what's number 4? Rashi says, Kodshim they did learn. Why? And that is why they were Boki and Kodshim. Even though Kodshim is not relevant, just like Taharas wasn't relevant, and Zroim wasn't relevant, but they learned Kodshim because of the Zgola, so what we learn from Rashi's Pshat in this Gemara is, in Zroim it doesn't work. In Taharas it doesn't work. Why didn't they learn Zohar and Taharas? To have those mitzvahs. So what we prove from this Rashi is, no. We find this in Chazal only by Korbanos, and it's unique to Korbanos. And that is Rachamei Shemayim, we should be able to be Zoicha in Kapora Savai. So what we learned today is a very fascinating discussion, but what we see is the importance of Talmud Torah, and an additional reason why Talmud Torah is so important. So how many Mamorei Chazal do you remember that stress the importance of Talmud Torah more than any other mitzvah? How many Chazals do you remember? One you should remember from every morning. I hope you say all the stuff that's in the Siddur before Psukkah de Zimmer. So every day in the morning we say a Mishnah, the beginning of Masechet Peah, and we say, Edvarim She'enem Shiur, Edvarim She'enem Oichel Pereseim, V'Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. Sof Perek Kama de Kiddushin. The Gemara is Misupek Talmud Godel Maise Godel. And the Gemara says, Talmud Godel She Talmud Meivele de Maise. So, in a way, Talmud Torah is the most important mitzvah. It is not because learning is more important than mitzvahs. To the contrary. Why is Talmud Torah the greatest mitzvah? Because without Talmud Torah, you cannot be a good Jew. Without Talmud Torah, how would you know what you have to do? Without Talmud Torah, how would you know how to daven, what to daven, why it's important to daven? Without Talmud Torah, you wouldn't know how to perform the mitzvahs, and neither why to perform the mitzvahs, and why are they so important. So Talmud Torah on one hand is Keneged Kulam, but the reason Talmud Torah is so important is Talmud Mevi Liyadei Mais. Adam la'amal yulad, la'amal azoshatevis lilmoid al-menat la'asot. So when we learn Torah, what we learn from Torah is how to serve a Kodesh Baruch Hu. So my Rebbe, the Kloisenberger Rebbe, many times used to tell this anecdote that a person once came to the Divrei Chaim and he was so proud of himself, and he said, I learned the entire Masechet Bava Metzia, and I learned Bava Kama, and the Divrei Chaim asked him, but what did you learn from Bava Metzia? And what did you learn from Bava Kama? What did Bava Metzia teach you? And what did Bava Kama teach you? So it's great that you learned Bava Metzia, but have you learned from Bava Metzia? So Torah is the most important mitzvah. But the reason is because when you learn Torah, you know what a Kodesh Baruch Hu expects of you. So there's a famous maimer of Reb Pinchas ben Yoer, brought now by the Zohar Daf Yutes. Torah meviari de zehirus and zrizus and akius and precious starts off with Torah. So which of the great Gedolim wrote an entire sefer on the Seder Avoid of Reb Pinchas ben Yoer? Zehirus, zrizus, nakius, precious, tahara. Are you familiar with the sefer? Still Yishur, of course. But he skips Torah. How come he skips Torah? The Pinchas ben Yair starts with Torah. Torah mevi'er the Zehiris, Zrizis, Nekiyas, Prishas. He starts with Zehiris. Why does he skip Torah? So there's a letter from Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner, the Pachad Yitzchak. And he says, B'derech Moshel, so these midas are like steps, like stairs. It's a stairwell. The first step is Zehiris, second step is Zrizis, then Nekiyas. Torah is the banister you hold on to as you walk up the stairs. Torah is not a step. Torah is the handrail. Yeah, the handrail. As you make this journey and as you climb up those steep stairs, you need to hold on to something, and that is Torah. It's a beautiful thought. But I don't think it fits in with the Lashon of Chazal, the Lashon of Pinchas ben Yair. He seems to say Torah mevia l'dei Zehiris. Zehiris to Zrizis. Zrizis to Nekiyas. So the Lashon of Pinchas ben Yair is mashma, does indicate that step number one is Torah, and then you go to number two, and then you go to number three. And I say the Mesilas Yesharim skipped nothing. So who remembers Perek Aleph of Mesilas Yesharim? Very first Perek. What's the heading? Bebiur klal choyves ha'odam b'yoylamai. That's the pshat of the Mesilas Yesharim Torah. What do you mean, Torah? What does a Pinchas ben Yair mean when he says Torah meviyah l'dei Zehiris? What? What part of Torah? So before you embark on this journey, you need to know why it's important to get there. And I say a moshel. A king, a president, a prime minister calls his chief of staff of his army, and he says, this is an important operation, and it's a really difficult one. It's an airborne mission. You need to go mitachas lahorei choshech, 10,000 miles away, and conquer a fort. And the general writes his calculations, and he says, I need this and I need that. I need 500 paratroopers, and I need some tanks and some armored vehicles and a lot of ammo, food. And the king says, just a minute. Before you tell me what you need, listen carefully what I need. And why this mission is so important and failure is not an option. Because if this mission fails, we're all doomed. You and your wife and your children and your family, we're all doomed. Because if you don't understand the importance of this mission, you will never succeed. So the Pinchas ben Yair says, I have a mission for you. But if you don't understand why this mission is so important, you have no chance of succeeding. It's a tough one. It's a tough one. To conquer all your midas, Zehiris and Zriyas and Nekiyas and Precious. This is a real tough one. And if you don't understand why you need to do this, you'll never succeed. And that is Torah. It's only when you learn Torah you understand why you're here, why we were born, what this world is all about. So Torah is bebiur klal choyves ha'odam b'yoylamai. And that is step number one. So Torah, that is why Torah is more important than any other mitzvah. And what we learned today is Torah also has a special zgula l'chaper avoin, as if a person was makrav kol hakorbanos kulam. So today we learned an important sugya. Next week, Friday, is the... Okay. So I hope to be going to Poland with some of you this week, Be'ez Hashem Yisborach. And I hope we'll have very memorable moments, both in Kivrei Tzadikim and at the other sites we will visit. So obviously this is the last year from this man, and it was a pleasure to visit the yeshiva and to teach Torah to our precious Talmidim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yazreinu for many more wonderful years to come, and Olif Shura V'Kosher and Freilich and Pesach. Did I say a bracha?